Good morning, everybody. My name is Claudia Della Mora. I'm a managing director of Black Legend Capital. I've been in M&A and investment banking all my life. I come from Merrill Lynch and cover several industries so far, from hospitality to consumer products, oil and gas, natural resources, and finally cannabis in the past 7 years. I'm based in Los Angeles, California. So I'm going to introduce the panelists here. Marcus Moser, based in Germany, right? He's partner at Zurich and Moser Consulting, so consulting firm, advisory based in Germany. He is focusing also in different industries, and he comes from natural resources, mining, but in the past few years has been focusing into the cannabis industry in Europe. Then we have David Traylor, Golden Eagle Partners, Managing Director of Golden Eagle Partners, a consulting advisory service group as well, focusing cannabis. And finally, we have Jamie Pearson, President CEO of Bank. So this panel is comprised of 3 advisory investment banking consulting people and an entrepreneur, CEO of a multi-state operator, vertically integrated cannabis company in North America. All right, great. So what are the differences between US and global strategies for investment and operations? Let's start from Moser. Moser, can you tell us a little bit, your point of view on differences and similarities between US or North American, Canada as well, and European companies in their operation strategies?
I think, first of all, if you look at US, they are front runners in the sector, and the companies are much larger than in Europe. And I think in US, a lot of companies acting globally. In Europe, most companies are just acting in their countries because it's a bit, I would say, a very fragmented sector in Europe.
Right. And just to elaborate on that, why do you think North American companies are acting internationally versus, differently from European companies acting more domestically?
I think, first of all, they have much more money because the money markets in North America, especially in US, also Canada, are much larger. So they have a lot of cash funds to invest abroad. And of course, they invested, too much money, so they lost a lot of money. If you look at the stock market, if you look at, the listed cannabis companies, the stock went down, market cap went down, because I think they invested, I would say, not smart, the money they got.
Beautiful. Actually, I'm going to jump to Jamie here, because I know, her background. So based on what Moser just said, right, Marcus?
Marcus.
So, sorry. So he's saying that the reason why North American companies are going international is because they have more money. Do you agree with that? In terms of, is there like a growth problem here?
I don't think so. I don't agree with that. I think and I don't think you're wrong. I think I think there's more to the story. And I think the piece that I would add to that, couple things. Number one, let's take the publicly listed company Trulieve, for example. Their market cap's down. I think they're trading around $12 when they normally operate around $28. They were around a $10 billion market cap. I think now they're at like $2.5 billion. They've put up 18 profitable quarters. They've continued to exceed analyst expectations. That's not because they're making bad decisions that their market cap's low. As I said in my keynote, the entire sector is down. So I don't think that you can say that American companies are making bad decisions. I think it's cannabis, you're swimming upstream. You are operating in prohibition, and capital is not easy to get. It doesn't matter what continent you're on, because there is a stigma, there's a lot of fear. But what I will say is you can run a fantastic company right now, and your market cap's gonna be in the tank. That's just the reality of the world that we live in right now. I think, to answer your question, why are US companies looking to come to Europe? It's a burgeoning market. We're starting to see the, playing out of what we witnessed and what we experienced in the US in 2016, 2017, as different states started to legalize, and you're starting to see the spread of cannabis across the European continent. It's very exciting. And for those of us that have experienced that first to market success, we got another market that we can go jump in and be first to market. I think that's why these American companies are looking for other opportunities where they can jump in and take a stranglehold on a market and be first to market. That's what I think is happening.
Exactly, other opportunities. So what are the current US MSOs expansion consolidation strategies and reasoning, behind that?
Well, I've had several MSOs approach me to, put my fingertips out into the world and see where there's opportunity. And what they're doing is trying to smell who are the operators that are tied into money, who are tied into legislation, and who are really kind of are operating in the background and they know what's happening. And so the MSOs who've been there, done that, are smart and they're looking for the operators. So with that being said, if you're an operator out there and you're running an operation that is well-funded, that's connected legislatively, and that has the ability to do big business across multiple countries, you should come find me.
Let's ask a question to David, actually, as a, continuing from this topic. Can you tell us a few strategies for cannabis investment operators that we've seen work internationally, better or worse, from the United States into other countries?
Thanks, Claudia. Actually, let me step back a little because, first of all, I'm an investment banking firm, Golden Eagle Partners. We're the first investment bank to be in cannabis in the U.S. We jumped in 2013. But I think I want to tell a little story because it helps inform our perspectives, because I've been very lucky to do what we're doing, because I started out in biotech, have 2 undergrad degrees, biochem, molecular biology, and got into biotech companies. Actually, one based here in Berlin-Buch, 15 years operational experience. Luckily, got inventorship on 2 U.S. patents for my work in bioprocessing with recombinant hemoglobin. So that's, as you guys know, bioprocessing is a huge part of this industry, whether you're talking hemp, marijuana, CBD, THC, whatever you want to call it. Got into investment banking in 2005 doing biotech deals. Also did 5 years of business development, working with companies doing deals with Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and then moved back to Colorado in 2009 to lead the life science group at a group called Headwaters. And then left in 2012 to found Golden Eagle Partners, and that's when Colorado and Washington voters legalized it. So in 2013, we started working in the industry. We've done 25 deals in the space. We helped PharmaCann raise, one of the leading MSOs, raised $30 million. We helped Panacea, which is a leading hemp processor, do a strategic deal in 2019. But we've also spoken around the world on cannabis. We're the only investment bank in Davos in 2020. We've spoken in Dubai, Toronto twice, Cayman, Frankfurt earlier this year, and obviously now Berlin. And one last thing too, if you guys know Athletes for Care, it's a great group. I played pro lacrosse, so I've been an athlete ambassador for Athletes for Care for 5 years, and then also I'm the chief scientific advisor for the industry, or for Athletes for Care. So I put together a group of the leading scientists, including Ethan Rousseau, Guillermo Moreno-Sanz from Spain, Raquel Perube from Uruguay, and also Deb Kimless from the US. So when you're talking about science, cannabis, and finance, we certainly are a global leader. But as far as getting back to, hey Nick, as far as the strategies for even investment and operation in the title here, one thing I want to say quickly is failure coming from the science side is a great teacher, especially if you learn from failure, it's not so bad, right? So essentially, we've seen a number of things, failures, and I mentioned this in Davos. Certainly a couple of the problems, people assume markets are going to open up much quicker than they do. We've seen that as a problem. You may know Canopy Growth put $40 million into a facility in South Africa and then selling it for pennies on the dollar. The other thing that we know a lot about is that biological supply chains are inherently unstable. And so a lot of these growers, you name it, I mean, Aurora had the big facility out of Edmonton that they shut down. And I'll tell you, if you want to talk to me later, I actually know the reason why. But they assumed, all these producers assumed, okay, we grow, they'll come, which was another fallacy. And then the other thing that we found, and I think Jamie will agree, there's actually been very little history of first mover advantage in this industry. Cerna, where I worked at, I was chief business officer at Cerna. I failed to mention one of the first public companies in the space. It went public in March 2014. They were the biggest name in cannabis in 2014. They had the biggest booth at the NTIA events. They're nowhere to be found now. You got Dixie, they're gone. Canopy Growth, who knows what's going to happen with that, right? So those, I think, failure, when you can talk to me later, is a great teacher on whether what you do with operations or what you do on investment.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the first mover advantage? Actually, first of all, I want to introduce. Well, yes. Sorry. I'd like to introduce Nicolas Faes, Senior Research Analyst at Bryan and Garnier, so another research analyst, consulting advisory guy here. Hi, how are you? Finally, he was stuck in he went to the other hotel, unfortunately.
Yeah, and on top of that, then you couldn't enter the hotel here because there was an important person who was trying to get out of the hotel, so the police blocked everybody getting in the
There's
hotel.
a delegation here at this hotel.
But welcome, sorry to be late. Thank you.
So no, just David, really quickly, like the first mover advantage, because we're seeing like, Mexico coming online, like Brazil very soon, of course, all these countries in Europe, and now Thailand as well, right? So, why do you think first mover advantage is not a good thing?
Well, actually, people, Jamie will love this. The problem is there's been too much arrogance and too little humility in this industry. People think that they're first mover, they've got $4 billion. I mean, that's gone from Canopy Growth. So that's, I think, the very short and sweet of it is if you're going to be successful in this industry, take a little humility and don't be so arrogant.
To that point, I think what happens a lot is people that have had success in mainstream business have a level of arrogance, and they come in and they're like, oh, well, there's a bunch of stoners. We're going to come in and we're going to show them how to do stuff. And then they don't realize it's not that simple. Cannabis is a very difficult business, and it's its own industry, it's its own community, and there's a lot to know about operating both in and out of the legal sphere or in the gray area. And a lot of traditional business people aren't comfortable operating in the gray area, and you better get used to it if you're going to be in cannabis.
Right, so cannabis actually is comprised of so many verticals, right? So we're looking at agriculture, of course, biotech, manufacturing, now technology, distribution, and consumer products and pharma, right? So Bang is a consumer product company, a little bit like, also Canopy took that approach, right? Can you give us a comparison between the normal consumer product CPG industry versus, the one in the cannabis and the problems?
The most obvious one in the US is if I were, let's say, producing, I don't know why tampons come to mind. If I were producing that, I'm going to produce it in one spot, and then I'm going to put it on a truck and I'm going to ship it to all 50 states. But in cannabis, I have to have 50 different manufacturing facilities because it's federally illegal, which means that I can't do interstate commerce. I can't cross state lines. Well, that means as a manufacturer of chocolate, I have to have 50 different chocolate machines. And when they're, let's say, $150,000 to $250,000 a piece, it becomes cost prohibitive to automate the manufacturing of the product times 50. So then I'm making decisions about how many redundant machines do I want to have. There are some places where I can't make the decision to get rid of it. I have to have a tempering machine in every single facility where I'm at. But I don't necessarily have to have the big fancy flow wrapper. I can do that manually or with a foot pedal because I don't want to have 49 redundant flow wrappers. I'm always parallel processing federal legalization. And then the other thing is basically in cannabis, we struggle with banking and we struggle with marketing. Right now, every single person, I would argue, on the globe is buying their products on their phone, right? In that device they have in their pocket. Cannabis companies are not allowed to market on social media, on Facebook. And so we kind of have to swim upstream in the marketing world. and do what I call guerrilla marketing. So you have to do targeted marketing, you want to use influencers, and you kind of have to figure out ways around it. So if you're an agile business operator, and I would argue that's the other reason why we need to pull people from the roots and the suits. We need to pull the roots into the industry, is that these are people that already have experience operating in an upstream environment and having to go around being out in the open. So those are the people that are going to give us advice about how do you get the word out. How did Jungle Boys, for example, when they opened in Florida, Jungle Boys outsold every MSO on day one with no social media. Tell me how they did that. We need to go talk to them because they can tell us how they did that. But if we have the arrogance to think, oh, well, I come from CPG and I know what to do, I can't tell you how many times I've had an executive come from mainstream go, oh, all you got to do is, I'm like, well, if you want to spend your money doing that, but I'm going to tell you right now, it's not going to work and it's going to be a waste of money. And that's what invariably happens, and that's why Canopy is losing, $100 million or $300 million a year, is because they're just throwing money at problems, and you've got to be strategic.
So you don't think Constellation gave a good direction to the company?
I think Constellation came in and thought they were going to treat cannabis like alcohol, and it just doesn't work like that.
So you touched on marketing. Marketing is a big problem in the United States. What about
It's
Europe?
global. Facebook isn't going to let you market cannabis in Europe either. It's a global problem.
Right, perfect. So let's ask a question to Nick. You have a deep knowledge in the market, you're a research analyst. So what advantages does the European market have over the US market for investment operations? Have we seen European companies attracting blue chip companies like North American companies have?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Okay. So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages of European and US companies, right? With your expertise in different markets, can you tell us the advantages or disadvantages of the European market over the U.S. market for investments and operations? Have you seen European cannabis-based companies attract blue chip, investments, strategic investments, as much as North American companies?
Well, but even the North American market, initially there were larger CPG companies who were looking and putting their toes in the water. We had some tobacco companies, we had some beverage companies, including Constellation Brands. But I think that they have been coming back from that idea. Take Imperial Brands, for example, who took a stake in Oxley and in the UK, Oxford Cannabinoid Technologies. Initially, they were very much looking at cannabis as something that could be a new product and relieve some of their growth problems, but only to realize that they were actually defocusing from their core business. So they say, well, okay, let's stop that. And I think also Constellation Brands have been looking at like that. Same with AB InBev, who had that joint venture with Tilray, but then said, well, no, we think that the risk is too high for us to be involved at this stage in the cannabis area. So I think that most large CPG companies who initially were looking at that sector, they have come back from that idea. So it is, unfortunately, it will be just on our own, and we don't need to look at those bigger companies to support the cannabis industry.
Okay, so would you agree that the biggest multinational cannabis companies can be divided kind of in two sections: consumer product and pharmaceuticals? So what kind of trends have you seen in Europe versus North America?
I think also on the pharmaceutical level is exactly the same. And take, for example, a Belgian company, UCB, is very strong in epilepsy. Didn't dare to touch at all anything that has to do with cannabis, just because they were all afraid that it could come back with them and hurt them. Because they all had, of course, the recent opioid crisis in mind. And they're all a bit afraid and say, well, if only that something similar will happen to cannabis, let's stay away and see how things develop. So I think also for the medicinal cannabis market, it's a little bit like that. And what happened with the Canadian companies, who initially were medicinal cannabis companies, then came adult use, and then they did not know what to do. So they just do everything. Oh, we're doing a bit of medicinal, and we're doing a little bit of adult use, and let's go in Europe. Let's go in Europe as well and have and do a bit of that as well. And they just spend money without having their basis operations in order. And that was the problem with the Canadian ones. Some of the US MSOs are slightly better in doing so.
Yeah, I call that the something shiny syndrome, and part of it is, oh, there's something shiny over here and over here and over here, because there's so much opportunity that there's a bottomless pit of where you could spend money to try to make money. But I think you're right. You have to stick to your core focus and get really good at what you're doing. I will say, it makes me angry that the stigma is stopping these big companies from diving in. And I think if there was one company that had a CEO with big enough balls to do it, they're gonna go make a lot of money. But everybody's afraid. And I think this fear, it's time for it to be over, because we know that cannabis is helping people with epilepsy and Parkinson's, and we're only gonna know what we're able to do with research. We need medical research. We need the governments to knock it off. And I mean, if I could wring all of their necks personally, I probably would.
Or a CEO with big enough ovaries.
Well, ask me to do something and I'll probably do it. I'm just...
Why not? Exactly. So what this is completely out of, but what we had here, but so would you recommend the government or FDA to be way more involved and, basically regulate better, but also substantiate what's going on?
The hard part is anything that you say is going to be controversial, because if we ask the government to deschedule cannabis from Schedule 1, then it's going to open a whole nother can of worms. But what we really need is access to medical research, so that I look at it like we just don't even know how many cannabinoids exist right now. We don't know what the combination of this one, that one, and this terpene could do for this or that ailment. What we have is a ton of anecdotal evidence, and we know that nobody's ever overdosed on cannabis. So we know that it's a plant-based medicine. We know that it's generally non-addictive. We know that it's safe. All of those things, I'm making these statements, and I don't even know if I'm speaking the truth, because I'm going off anecdotal evidence. What it would really be great is if we could figure out that when you have epilepsy of this sort, that you take this combination, like my daughter has epilepsy. She's probably gonna kill me if she hears me. We have her on cannabinoid therapy. They give her THC, full spectrum CBD, which includes a small amount of THC, THCA, linalool, limonene, and turmeric. Well, is there a pill that she can take that has all of those? No. I happen to be a cannabis executive, so I can go get linalool, I can go get limonene, I can get THCA, I can get full spectrum CBD. So I have my daughter off of anti-seizure medications, which were making her sleep for 18 hours a day at 21 years old. That should be available to everyone who has epilepsy, not just the daughter of a cannabis executive. Because she's not had a seizure in 2 years on that medication. That's groundbreaking, because we know that these anti-seizure medications have so many side effects. That's one ailment. But think about Parkinson's and think about all the other things. Think about anxiety. Just think about the people that want to use cannabis instead of alcohol, which is a poison. Opiates, which is a poison and is super addictive. Our governments are going to have to step up and give the people what they want. It's time, globally.
So, do you think that more clinical studies would benefit not only the pharma, vertical of the industry, but also the consumer product vertical of the industry?
Absolutely. I mean, the more we know, the better we do, right?
Correct, exactly. Nick, give us a little bit of information on the European and German market. So I heard that the German market could be potentially as big as the California market. Can you give us some, can you shed some light on this?
I think if you look at all the markets across the globe, and when we look at how large are those markets, and there's a complicated calculation on how often does somebody consume cannabis and at what rate do they consume. But on average, it's around 160 grams per annum for the cannabis consumers. So that is true in Canada, that's true in California, that is true in Florida. So it's around that 160 grams on average. So I would expect that that's exactly the same in Europe. So if we then look at what the prevalence rate is in Germany, for example, that's just over 7%. So 80 million at 7%, that's 5.4, I believe. 160 grams, well, that is close to 1,000 tons, so 950 tons. And that is at the current stage. Right? And in all the markets, whenever there is a trend to legalize cannabis, we've seen an uptick in those prevalence rate because there are consumers who would love to try it, would love to be on cannabis, but don't dare to go to the black market or so. And that it's quite a significant uptick. It's about 50% uptick that we're seeing. For example, Canada, 2015 or so, prevalence rate was 15%. Now it's 21%. Same was true in California. Although we had that old heritage in California. So same will happen in Europe and in Germany. So for example, if you go back to my 7%, well, let's say it ticks up to 10%. Well, 10, that's 8 million times 160, that is 1,300 tons or so. Way more than the 400 tons that somebody came up a couple of years ago. So I think that was a very strong underestimation.
And I think you need to couple with that the fact that Germany is the size of Oregon, geographically, and has public transport. And when you think about the whole US market, or you just think about California geographically, getting product to all of the people of California is a challenge. It'll be much easier to do it in Germany. I think the distribution in Germany is much more sophisticated. So if you do have that 10% and you have that small geographic location, I think you're going to see the penetration increase at a much higher rate.
Well, that's a good point. What about other countries in Europe at the moment? Can you give us some information on
I think
the infiltration percent?
Everybody's looking at what Germany is going to do, how they're going to get around legalizing adult use cannabis, and then others will very quickly follow. Portugal, Italy probably as well, Luxembourg, Malta, who has tried before. Switzerland is already legalizing adult use, whatever way you look at it.
So, but give us a little bit of some numbers, like, the projected market size in Europe or in Germany.
Well, the same reason that we did earlier for Germany, we can use for Europe. Okay, in some countries like France or Italy or Spain, the prevalence rates are higher already today than that 7% in Germany. But then if we look at it all in all, well, we come at a market which is probably be 6,000, 7,000 tons, and then pick your price at which current black market price is 10 euros. Probably will go down because the 10 euros black market, that is a not competitive price. It's a monopoly run by the cartel. So it will come down, say, to don't know, 7 euros, just to say something. 7,000 tons times 7, that's 49, that's 50 billion market in Europe.
Markets. I mean, seriously, as I mentioned before, they've always been overhyped. I mean, the problem with this industry is it's going to be a race to the bottom. It's going to be a commodity, and it's going to be about your supply chain, okay? When you're talking about Europe, where is it going to be produced, and how is it going to be produced? Is it going to be Colombia? Is it going to be Lesotho? Is it going to be Canary Islands? Is it going to be Greece, Guernsey, Jersey, Cyprus? We've talked to groups all in those countries, Macedonia, maybe Portugal. I don't know the frickin' answer, and nobody in this room does. The other question is, how is it going to be produced? Is it going to be produced just as a phytosource? Is it going to be, for example, there's companies now in the US that are producing hemp, growing it outside, producing CBD and doing a simple chemical conversion to delta-9 THC. Then do you have yeast, you have E. coli, do you have chemistry, or do you have a combination thereof where you grow, as I mentioned, some kind of certain cannabinoid or purify it out? And I don't have the answer either, although I'm pretty smart scientifically. So I think, you know, the markets have always been overhyped, and you name it. The question is, what is the supply chain in 5 years going to look like, and where is it going to be produced?
You know, I agree, and whatever market that we look at, there's always an oversupply. And that will be a feature of this industry for the decades to come. So in the growing, there will be oversupply, way more than demand can stomach. So on growing at wherever it comes from. Initially, Germany probably will be the garbage bin of the world. Probably everybody who has some excess capacity will start, if they are allowed to, exporting to Germany. So
Part of it's because of the energy consumption. And so what I'm hoping is that Germany will allow growers to grow in Germany. I don't predict that will happen because of the energy consumption. And so it is, I think you're right, the garbage, I wouldn't call it the garbage, but whatever. I think the cannabis will come in, but I think that David makes a great point because you can grow outside, you can use the sun. I think it's weird that we thought that people were gonna grow cannabis indoors in Canada and mimic the sun. How expensive is that for you to have a giant warehouse, have a bunch of lights, and then grow it inside? When I think about from a chocolate standpoint, nobody grows sugarcane in a warehouse and mimics the sun so that they can make a product. You know, ultimately it is a commodity. But I do think, and the market thing I agree with, but I also think you have to have market predictors to know what the demand is going to be so that you can kind of wrap your brain around it. What I've seen is this cycle of governments always come in with fear and they don't issue enough licenses, and then the people sell out. It's crazy. I predict this will happen in Germany. They're gonna, the day one of sales, doesn't matter what it is, everyone's gonna sell out. And they're gonna go, oh crap, we need more. And then they're gonna open up the floodgates, and then too much cannabis is gonna come in, and you're gonna have an oversupply. This happens every single time. And then the market speaks. And then it's the good operators who are running good companies that will make it, and everybody else gets flushed out. So these companies that you talked about in the very beginning in 2014 that don't exist, you know, this is the cycle. There's a reason they don't exist, right? So
you know, in the end, it will be, and that's where cannabis is very similar to other CPG companies. It are the proper operators who have a strategy, who know their consumers, who produce at low cost, and try to differentiate their product and brands. That are going to be the winners. And in that sense, it's very similar to other CPG companies.
at the end of the day, the commodity that we are all going to end up fighting for is shelf space.
Yeah, let's talk about that
Period.
one. By the way, yes, it's important, the consumer product space. So what is the difference between shelf space seen as a commodity in regular consumer product companies versus cannabis?
Well, think about when you go into a grocery store, you have these end caps, you have entire companies whose job it is to merchandise products. So they come in and they teach the CPG companies how to put products at eye level, how to bribe the store so that they're not down here on the shelf, that they're not up here on the shelf. You all want eye level. You want to have their colors in your branding. So we all know all the fast food companies in America, they're all red and yellow. Wendy's, McDonald's, they're all red and yellow. Why? Because that is the psychological color of hunger, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes very sophisticated, very scientifically oriented.
McDonald's.
It's big business. That is all big business. Cannabis right now is everybody who's got a little bit of a creative, bone, they create some cool brand, and that's all going to wash out. And we're going to see it become systemized and scientifically designed. I'm wondering if Marcus has any insight into that coming from your area.
What I would add that in Europe, the companies have less money, and I think the problem you mentioned, and coming back to I think Trulieve is a good company, it's a good example, but there are also negative examples in the industry, and I think Europe has the advantage that there is not enough money available for the sector at the moment, so the company really have to spend the money smart, and I think that's an advantage, but also disadvantage, because it goes slower as expected. And I think the problem is really the legal frame, because I would compare Europe with US, because you have 28 countries with different laws, and in US it's similar. You have different states, some states is allowed, some not, and I think that's the problem, that we need a European-wide legal frame that companies can operate.
So we have only a few minutes. Is there anybody here who would like to ask a question to the panel? Just raise your hands.
Here for Claudia and the whole panel, first of all. It's fantastic.
Hello, good morning. My name is Philippe Rogadar. I come from Merck's in the UK. We make inhaled cannabinoid therapy. We come from the pharma sector. I have a question about investment, the big elephant in the room, particularly when it comes to clinical evidence. So you, Jamie, particularly said we need clinical evidence. That's very expensive. And at the moment, I don't think the margin on the products, particularly flowers, justify the investment. So can someone comment on that elephant in the room? How are we going to raise the money? Who is going to pay for it, and how the product's going to pay for it?
Let's let the investment advisor answer that one.
Well, coming from biotech, I think there's a company called Radical Science, if you know, out of LA, started by Jeff Chen, who's essentially doing this with cannabinoids, where you can do like what's called a stage 4 trial. Essentially, it's kind of out in the market where you're doing really good data analytics. So that's one of the things. You guys look them up. They're doing some really interesting things. So that's a cheaper way to go. We actually are working right now with EPM, which is one of the leading Israeli companies generating cannabinoid acids, and they're going to do a clinical trial process. They need to raise a lot of money, but you bring up a good point. You need to be creative and find a way to finance really good science that's not a clinical trial, because most people we know, and we've been raising money for science-based cannabis companies since 2015. It's not easy because you're straddling the biotech cannabis sector, and the biotech investors don't want to do cannabis. They don't like to do weed. And then you look at the cannabis sectors and they're like, that science makes my head spin. So it's a very good question, and frankly, I don't have an answer, especially in 10 seconds.
Well, I think necessity is the mother of invention. So the fact that we need it, somebody's going to figure it out. People are figuring it out, like Jeff Chen. But I think the other thing is, what I find in cannabis is that there's a lot of personal stories, that you have incredibly high net worth individuals or family offices where they have a personal story or a personal connection to the plant. And then you have some people that are single-handedly funding things because they're passionate about what's happening.
Anybody else would like to ask a question? We have 1 minute, less than 1 minute.
All right, I think you've taught them everything they need to know.
All right, perfect.
Let's hear it again for Claudia and Marcus and Jamie and everyone.